Debating death and memory, past and present. It's an archaeodeath debate.
So in February 2015, I wrote a blog post on my Archaeodeath blog called The Plague of Terms, the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the reason I did that was back in 2015, in those halcyon days, I'd long been aware that my early medieval archaeological research, my research of the periods of 5th to the 11th centuries AD, focusing mainly on archaeology but involving literary evidence and historical sources and place names as well, has tended to use the term Anglo-Saxon alongside a host of other terms to describe the period. But I realised a lot of specialists and students and the public get very confused about this many different terms that we use for the period. So in this video, I want to review what I said in that blog post from 2015, from February 2015, evaluate, as I did in that post, some of the key terms we use and the problems with them, and then to suggest some solutions for how we move forward. Now, I must say, at the time, when I was writing in 2015, it was really aimed at the general public and students. I hadn't quite realised that so many allegedly scholars are confused about the specialist use of terminology within our field too. And that only goes to prove that the terminology needs to be addressed, needs to be evaluated in much more detail, and perhaps we need to be much clearer about when we use terms and why we use the terms that we do, or we don't use them at all. We move forward with different terms. Okay, so to start off with, the periods from the 5th to 11th centuries are the period in which we have the most archaeological and historical terms for over any other period. That's my contention. And it's a pain in the backside. That's why I call it a plague of terms, because Anglo-Saxon is just one of a host of terms that get used in specialist literature, popular context, popular culture, public engagement, the interface between academia and the public. We use these terms all the time in different ways, and they are a menace because no one knows really exactly what we're talking about, and the terms come with baggage and all manner of connotations. Now, for the 5th to 11th centuries, you will find in the expert literature and in the popular books the period being called early medieval as a general term, without geographical parameters, without any specific chronological indicator. It's a 5th to 11th century is early medieval, and that term is also used particularly by historians for the 11th, 12th centuries. So the beginnings of what we would call the later Middle Ages. In parts of Northern Europe, early medieval does actually refer to the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. So we have a confusion there. And that is embodied in almost every other term that we have. So sub-Roman gets used to refer to the 5th and maybe early 6th centuries in some parts of Britain, the immediate period after Roman rule ends in Britain at the beginning of the 5th century. Sub-Roman, and that has all sorts of connotations of negative associations with decline, of being only understood in relation to the Roman period and as something lesser and later than it. Post-Roman gets used a lot as well as a more general term, and no one really knows where the parameters of that lie, but it means just after Rome, so we're post-Roman in one regard, I suppose. But it's hazy, and it's at least it's geographically not specific. So sub-Roman and post-Roman get used, and of course that only applies to parts of northwestern Europe that were once in the Roman world and are now after the Roman administration. But that confuses a lot of people, because there's a lot of parts of these islands which were never part of the Roman world, and there's parts of Northern Europe that stay part of the Roman world much longer, and parts of Eastern Europe, of course, and Southern Europe. Then we have the term late antiquity or late antique, that has been generally used for the Mediterranean, most famously by scholars like Peter Brown, Averell Cameron, to refer to that later Roman into early Byzantine imperial culture, Christian culture, if you like, at least in part, late pagan and Christian culture. But my point is, it's a term that is really developed for the Mediterranean world up to the Arab invasions and the spread of Islam and so on. And that has its own baggage, as you can appreciate too, linked to Judeo-Christian culture. And it has been used in Britain increasingly, and only by a minority of scholars, particularly in dealing with Western Britain and the areas that stay in contact with the Mediterranean world in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. Then we have broader terms like Dark Age, and again, like post-Roman. What does that even mean? A lot is a popularly used, but been bandied around and used in different contexts by different people. It has all sorts of derogatory associations with it. It implies that I've got the standard by which we understand the period is the volume of written sources that we have available to us. In that sense, the darkness refers to a lack of written evidence, but it also has baggage associated with levels of civilization and culture, assuming that the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries were a time when Europe was plunged back into a dark age. So it has that idea of we know nothing, and what we do know, it's a darker time. It's a more barbaric or regressive time. So Dark Age sucks as a term as well, although people will roughly know what you're talking about. Then we have terms like, used in Western Britain, particularly in Wales, early Christian. And in Ireland too, you hear this term early Christian to refer to the early Middle Ages or the period from the 5th to the 11th centuries. And that again has religious problems with it. It's relating to sort of a golden age ideology of early Christianity, sort of bringing light to the Isles. And there's all sorts of things there that are wrong with it. A rather neutral term, but early historic gets used, particularly in Scotland, referring to this as a time of the earliest historical references to kingdoms and communities. But of course, in other parts of the world, early historic has very different allusions depending on when written sources first appear. Whether we're dealing with the Near East and ancient Egypt, that's the Bronze Age, isn't it? Is early historical or proto-historical, or the late Bronze Age. So. And also, in other parts of the world, you could be talking about 18th, 19th century. So early historic has value, but it also has its limitations to it. Art historians and some archaeologists like to use the phrase insular, meaning pertaining to these islands, because it gets over talking about England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and the politics thereof, and it refers to the culture of interchange between particularly pre-Christian, but particularly Christian communities, their monasteries, their metalwork, their arts, their ivories, their manuscripts. It's useful to get away from talking about Anglo-Saxon, early Celtic, or indeed any other sort of ethnic term. But not many people know what you're talking about insular art or insular culture, And anyway, there's something very insular about insular. It is used to talk about the many international connections of these islands and their cultural links, but there is a suggestion there's something special or exceptionalistic about these islands. It goes on. I could go on and on and on. I will go on and on because this is important to remember that all these terms have their problems. Pre-Viking has a very limited use, but it just used to refer to treating the Viking Age, Lindisfarne, 793, the Viking raid on Lindisfarne as a kind of threshold. Things before then, but post-Roman, pre-Viking England. It refers to the 5th to 8th centuries, sure, but it has limited uses, and people aren't going to really get what you mean unless it's in a particular context. Late Celtic gets used to refer to particular kinds of metalwork and art. In many parts of Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and parts of Northern and Western Britain and Ireland, you could talk about late Iron Age is as good a term as any. And for the 5th, 6th centuries, used widely across Europe, the term migration period will sometimes be used by archaeologists when dealing with material culture of the 5th and 6th centuries, although again it has its issues because it assumes that migration, movement of population, is the defining characteristic of that period and no other. So I'm only sort of soundbiting the problems with each of these terms. There's many more to each of them that are problematic. Then we have as with later periods, the dynastic terms, which suck big time. They still get used, and some scholars seem to think these are somehow superior to other terms, which is hilarious to me. But you have Merovingian and Carolingian. People calling themselves Merovingianists and Carolingianists as if that escapes baggage and problems. I don't know what planet they're on, but anyway, it's a term we're familiar with. It's used by historians and archaeologists, but it has its baggage of assuming there's something distinctive about particular political regimes, their beginning, their continuance, and their end. So it's, where do we go from there? Viking. Viking is perhaps the most used and abused term of all, widely deployed to refer to the very end of the 8th or mid to late 8th in some parts of Scandinavia, 8th century through to the 11th century and sometimes 12th century, depending on where you're talking about. But the Viking world, the Viking era, the Viking Age, these terms are used interchangeably and with various specialist regional conjunctions. Hiberno-Norse to refer to Irish Sea zones of interaction in the Viking Age. Anglo-Scandinavian to refer to the Viking Age in England, really. Saxo-Norman, there's another, lots of hyphens. Get lots of hyphens. You can stick a hyphen in it, makes it okay. Saxo-Norman. Pictish, crying out loud. Yes, Pictish is widely used for central, northeastern Scotland, what is now Scotland, for the period, refer to the Pictish kingdoms, the Pictish tribes, and sometimes used for the late Roman period in those regions too, but mainly for the early Middle Ages. And then for lowland Britain, south and eastern England in particular, we have the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon. And for southern England, particularly south of the Thames, you see Saxon being used. And some archaeologists use that as a shorthand, Saxon, and Anglian for particularly East Anglia and East Midlands and Yorkshire. In particular, Yorkshire archaeologists like to use Anglian as a sort of more regionally specific use of pre-Viking and Anglo-Saxon term. And I'm sure there are others I've missed in this list, okay? So this is to make it clear that all of these terms, and these last terms, have Pictish, Anglo-Saxon, Irish, of course we could add to it, all have ethno-nationalistic baggage, and some of them are actually perceived in popular parlance as racial terms still, from their 19th century use of those terms. That's a separate topic I can't go into and give a lecture on here. And we could simply call these all mid to late first millennium, AD, CE, Common Era, whatever you prefer. But of course, first millennium has the confusion with the first millennium BC or BCE, which annoys late Bronze Age, Iron Age archaeologists intensely. So where do we go with all of this terminology? Where do we take this mixed bag? Well, the first thing I need to do to a bit of education, and this, if you are undergraduate students, this is the first thing I really tell you, and then I explain the problems with these terms, but that you're going to find them in the literature. And I make the point that there's many a specialist use of these terms. Here's an edited collection I co-edited. This is the Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History, Volume 14. Okay. So this is 2007, but Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History is a well-established, some call it a journal, some a monograph series. I don't know. I'll leave that to the editors to tell me which is right. But it says edited Sarah Semple on the cover. I don't know why they did that, because it was actually from a conference I organised, and there's 2 excavation reports at the end, but most of it is by me, and so it's a co-edited book. Okay. Commercial archaeologists, heritage bodies, the Portable Antiquities Scheme, they all use Anglo-Saxon to describe 5th to 11th century material culture. There's a few books from my shelf. So you have Springfield Lion. Early Anglo-Saxon cemetery as a term is a well understood frame of reference for cemeteries of the 5th to 7th century that contain sometimes cremation, sometimes inhumation, and often with furnished burials, objects in the graves. Okay. And there's other examples like this. That's from 2005. This is a bit earlier. It's the second report of the Lechlade Cemetery. Okay, this is another example for you. Anglo-Saxon Cemetery. Okay, so this is a well-recognised. People know what you mean if you're talking about these things. Most recently, there's really high-profile Anglo-Saxon Cemetery monograph, of course, Barrow Clump. Okay, so the literature uses this. The specialised literature uses these terms, and it's a shorthand for, in this case, early Anglo-Saxon. It says Anglo-Saxon Cemetery, but it means early Anglo-Saxon, really. It's 5th to 7th century. Okay. let's have a look at another couple of big prominent publications, just so that you're aware that this is what scholars are doing. Okay, so there's 2 books come out about the Prittlewell chamber grave. The really detailed monograph calls it the Prittlewell Princely Burial. Okay, that's the sort of detailed report. But the more popular book, the Anglo-Saxon Princely Burial. Now, people know what that means more than early medieval. Okay, it's less ambiguous. I could go on, and I just mentioned another one, the Staffordshire Hoard and Anglo-Saxon Treasure. Now, it is possible to avoid that term, and I tended to avoid it. I've never produced a book with Anglo-Saxon on the cover, apart from the 2007 co-edited series on book series on Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History, or whatever it is, volume 14. For example, my monograph, Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain. And I call it Early Medieval Britain because I talk about Scotland, Ireland, Wales, but mainly, not much Ireland, but it's mainly about the island of Britain. So I look at the Anglo-Saxon evidence within a broader context there. My Boyd L volume from 2015, Early Medieval Stone Monuments, because there's chapters in here on Ireland, on Norway, on Sweden, as well as the island of Britain. So Anglo-Saxon was never going to appear in the title or the subtitle because it's about themes in monuments and how we understand stone monuments, carved stone monuments, sculpted stone monuments, that cuts across those regional characteristics. So the term is there. What do we do with it? Well, I suggested in my 2015 blog post 3 reasons why we shouldn't just jettison the term. So stay with me for that. I talk about, first of all, how the term is already embedded in the specialist literature. Everyone knows it. It's used in a very precise way. Now, there are some woolly, problematic uses of it, but there's nothing really as an alternative. And early medieval is okay for broader swathes, but it's not very specific. So my first point is that there's no real ready replacement. Early medieval England it just didn't even hit my brain in 2015 as a possible solution, because it just doesn't, people don't know what you're talking about, and it's confusing because a lot of people think that means the 12th, 13th century or early 13th century. So no, that term is just not going to wash. You can use it, but it's not going to wash for our specialist literature. The second point is that the public know the term Anglo-Saxon as pre-Norman and post-Roman. They equate the 5th to 11th centuries with the Anglo-Saxon period, and I know that has geographical and cultural and ethnic problems with it on many different scales, but it is a term that people know and are familiar with, and in the same way as they use the term Vikings. We can talk about the academic material without using the word Vikings. No one needs to use these terms, but they're there in our literature and they are to be used. And the third point is that there is baggage associated with these terms, but if we abandon their use, we'll simply leave the discussion to the crazies and the fringe. We'll lose those terms. And on one level, that's a positive thing, because if you know anyone's using them, it shows they're not aware of the academic literature, but it's elitist, exclusory, and it also concedes intellectual territory to people who don't know what they're talking about. And for that reason, I said and I'm going to quote myself, in 2015, these terms come with baggage, but that baggage is often the very reason why their use is important, to flag up and critique rather than suppress earlier paradigms and their intellectual moorings and limitations. In other words, we could be at a risk of denying the problems with these terms if we just stop using them. If we abandon these terms and talk in opaque phrases, we risk extremists picking them up and utilising them to their own end. 2015. There are some solutions I suggested. We should talk about early medieval as a more general term where possible. And when we do use the terms, we try to be specific, perhaps only restrict their use to introductions. And in my work, that's exactly what I've done. I have used the term early Anglo-Saxon to refer to cemeteries, and I talk about them as a periodisation and a geographical spatial spread, but I don't use them to infer ethnic attributions to the occupants of those graves. So I don't talk about the Anglo-Saxons, it's lazy and sloppy. The Anglo-Saxons is generic, it doesn't mean anything. The people of the 11th century were nowhere like the people of the 5th, 6th century. So I use the term in a very specific way, and if I use it in a popular way, I then make sure that my text rapidly picks up and explains why. Now, you're welcome to delve back into my past literature and find failings on my part, and maybe I haven't in some articles been as clear as I could have, but we do have a responsibility whenever we use any terms, any of these terms, Pictish, post-Roman, Hiberno-Norse, to clarify what we mean and who are we talking about and what are we talking about. So I use it to refer to a specific early Anglo-Saxon England, even though I know England didn't really exist in the period I'm talking about, and the Anglo-Saxons weren't a group in the period we're talking about. Then we went around going, oh, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. That's not the way we're using the term. We're not using it as a term of self-definition for the people that we study, or their self-definition. They're our terms. They're unquestionably our terms. They have roots in the early Middle Ages. There are a few references to early Anglo-Saxon, or Anglo-Saxon as a term. But it's not really about that. It doesn't matter whether people use it in the early Middle Ages or not. It's our term, but we've got to be careful about how we use it to qualify it. So we've got to avoid lazy and casual use. And I've always felt that with our terminology. We've got to be very precise in our terminology, but jettisoning the terminology isn't necessarily the answer. And it shouldn't, I would say. Our use of these terms shouldn't in themselves impede the popular use of the understanding of complex and nuanced argument. Indeed, I would suggest that the terms can help us to introduce peoples and times in the same way as I believe this about Dark Ages. That's a heresy for some to say this, but I do believe that we can use this term in a positive way occasionally, maybe on book titles, maybe in paper titles, maybe deliberately to question the terms as a way into discussions. We should hold a degree of flexibility and respect that different disciplinary scholars will have different confidences in using different terms. But we need to communicate between disciplines and with wider publics of various different kinds globally. And to do that, we need to make sure our terms are clear, coherent, but also I would suggest when we're setting up barriers rather than breaking them down, if we just fail to introduce, explain and deploy terms in popular parlance that can be to our advantage. So it's about being strategic, being flexible, being understanding of how different scholars use these terms to mean different things. And I see, honestly, a lot of literary scholars using Anglo-Saxon in a very sloppy sense. They talk about the Anglo-Saxon mind, and actually they refer to about 3 monks living in the 10th or 11th centuries. You know, this it is sloppy and lazy, and we do it all the time. But we have to be aware that this comes with problems, and it's for other videos to talk about the nature of those problems, the extremist appropriation of the period. But I think they'll be doing it anyway because they don't really care about the period, but they certainly don't care about the detail of our research, and they'll do it anyway with other terms. And in fact, they'll use those terms as a badge of honour as soon as academics start telling them not to. So we have to play a very canny game here. Pick our battles, be flexible, and be robust about how we use them. And I suppose what we can do further to add to that is we can call out misuses, correct political discourses, populist uses. But we can't win, we can't fight every fight. We've got to be careful about making sure that we fight fights that are worth having. Now that was my take in 2015 with some added thoughts. Now, of course, from 2019, things took a more, should we say, heated turn in the debate about this term. And I never saw this coming because I assumed most scholars of the period had a much more nuanced understanding of how scholars use these terms than it seems to have transpired. Now, I won't address that debate that's happened from September, October 2019 through to today about axing the Anglo-Saxons, as one retired professor has called it. I'll talk about that in another context, but not right now. But I wanted to just review what I said in 2015 and add some points about why I said it, to give you a bit of an education, if that's all right, about the fact from an archaeological perspective, the term is widely used. The term Anglo-Saxon is one of many messy and problematic terms we have. And while we should be moderate in our use of it, careful in our use of it, explain when we use it, and call out people that misuse it, we also have to work with some terms to describe the material to ourselves, to other disciplinary experts who may not be familiar with our archaeological information, and also to the broader publics who may be actually interested in learning about this stuff.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Howard Williams on YouTube. In addition, consider following the ArchaeoDeath WordPress blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.